And Tonia will just turn the balance of our time now over to you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yes, I have to say I have a lot of favorite friends at BYU. It's kind of hard to escape when some of my mentors in grad school are now faculty at BYU. So I love getting to interact with all of you and this opportunity. Today, we're going to talk about weird science. At least that's the intro for my talk title. Before I get into this, I have to have a two-way. I can't just speak to a screen. So by a show of hands, how many of you have experienced science education in a distance learning environment? None. Wow. Not surprised at all. Can we imagine what happened when COVID hit and what science education did? Felt a little bit like a scene out of maybe SpongeBob, like running back and forth, screaming, Patrick with my hair on fire. What do? We're science. We're supposed to be hands-on. We're supposed to have labs and experiments. And now everybody has to go home. So we're going to use that as the precursor to jump into thinking about how do we prepare teachers who want to teach science in the middle of COVID. So I'm going to then go into screen share. And we're going to share a little story, if you will. As soon as I can get back your lovely faces and be able to see you all on my other screen. So this is the story of weird science, the challenges and benefits of preparing future teachers for distance teaching and learning. So when COVID hit, the headlines exploded. Here came the resources. Remote teaching resources from Open Science Ed. NSTA quickly jumped out with resources for teaching science, STEM remotely. Edutopia has a few different headlines. I grabbed this one in particular because I love that it had the teacher in front of the laptop trying to do an activity at home with the soap and the water and the plate. Let's do some viscosity activities, but it's not quite the same when there's a screen and we're not prepared for this. But this is what happened to science education 2 years ago next month. What do we do? How do we deal with this? We knew about different simulation websites. Discovery Earth stepped up and tried to create some curriculum. Some schools were using resources like STEM scopes. And so it might be easy enough for them to then just push those lessons out to students through Google Classroom and try to help them engage. Of course, that assumed that they also had access to internet and broadband reliably at home. I do live in Idaho. I live in rural Idaho at that. I don't even live in Moscow where U of I is located. I live technically in the zip code of Potlatch, but I'm somewhere in between Potlatch and Palouse. So if anybody eats Sabra hummus, by the way, thank you. Thank you very much on behalf of my neighbors, the Sawyers, whose garbanzo beans are purchased by Sabra and turned into your hummus. That gives you an idea of where I live in the Palouse. So we didn't have complete access to internet either, but we wanted to think about what does this future look like? But we had a particular reason for that. Dun, dun, dun. The problem. Not just teaching science, but what could we do in teacher ed? How do we fulfill pre-service clinical experiences when schools couldn't have non-essential personnel? So of course, COVID hit in the spring of 2020. Fall 2020 rolls around and the world is still sideways. And the schools are telling us, well, we're happy to take your interns because we could totally use them to support us through this. But beyond that, we're a little taxed. So any pre-internship clinical was off the table in the school districts. Couldn't place our practicum students at all. Couldn't place our service learning students at all. We got a little creative in the spring of 2020 when that happened for service learning and pre-internship clinicals, but now we're having to plan for it. So that was our key problem. How do we get their clinical experiences if we can't get into the schools? And oh, by the way, what if this is the classroom that we're looking at, where the learner's at home and there's a screen somewhere? Although I have to admit, when I went looking for a photo to depict learning during COVID at home, I'm a little jealous of this particular setup. I want this set up myself at home. Like this would make me work better, I'm pretty sure. But I also appreciated that if you look underneath the blue banner there, underneath there's a puppy dog curled up. Gotta have a puppy dog. But this was a solution that I went after to this particular scenario, a service learning partnership. Yes, and she's learning Hebrew. I love that comment. That was something else I noticed as well. Language learning got a little bit easier for some folks by learning at home. So with the problem, how do we fulfill clinical experiences? I decided to go after a service learning partnership and also tried to have the forethought to turn this into a case study and put it in IRB so that my students would give me permission to use what we were doing along the way. So in the middle, we have U of I teacher education. On the left side, we have Project WET. Anybody familiar with Project WET before I go into this? Oh, goody. I'm so excited to share Project WET with more people. It's a wonderful organization, by the way, that has been around for a very long time. And it looks like I do have my activity guide that I can show you at the end or when I get to that point. So on the left side, we have the Project WET Foundation and U of I Extension. So this is where I need to pause real quick. I am in teacher ed, obviously. That's what we're talking about science teacher ed. My K-12 licensure is from Texas. I've been drinking my water here with my Texas A&M water bottle. My licensure is in ag education. So I'm the ultimate applied scientist and looking at the intersections of disciplines. So extension is something that is in my DNA from my bachelor's degree and a natural partnership for me. I reached out to one of our extension educators who is a Project WET teacher. He is a mentor who teaches other Project WET mentors as well. On the right side, we're talking about authentic learners, and that's a double layer. Authentic learners meaning my students as pre-service teachers, but then also access for them with authentic learners. So let's explore this just a little bit and see what we mean here. Project WET produces learning activities for the classroom. So I'm going to slide backwards real quick, grab my book, and stop screen share to give this a little bit more context and kind of backwards load as my fancy camera zooms way in and eventually zooms out. There you go. So this is the Project WET activity guide. It's a beast. Everything in here aligns to the NGSS. And it has differentiation levels. So I can see that high water history, which is the activity that I just happened to turn to, is set for middle school. But then inside the activity, it also gives me some differentiations in case I wanted to take it down to elementary or up to high school. So this is a Project WET activity guide, and these are typically done in the classroom. Project WET was looking for help on how to turn these into distance learning activities. So if we go back into screen share, you're going to see the outcome, and then we're going to talk through the story of how this outcome came to be. My students, to solve the problem, delivered free remote learning science activities. So this is actually a redacted slide that we were using to promote and market the activities that my students led. The general public, and by general public, I mean the United States, could click these links and register for our workshops. So you can see my list on the left of my teachers, all of my pre-service teachers in my class. You can see the activities that they were leading, and that is the activity title from the book that I just had in my hand. The day that they were holding it so that families could plan for this. And you can see that we also targeted different times to kind of experiment with what that would look like. All times were listed in Pacific Standard Time. And then grade level, because I had my students pick a 2-grade band to help us communicate with families what target we had. And then how many seats. I let my students tell me what was the maximum enrollment for the activity that they were planning. The far right side included the link to an Eventbrite event with free registration. And we did not collect any information about the learners. We literally asked the parents to register and then just provide a name, a first name for what to call their student. We then emailed families with the link. So that way we didn't have to worry about COPA. We didn't have to worry about FERPA. We weren't collecting any privacy information. We literally just needed to communicate, here's the link to join, and what do we call your student when they join? So this is the end game. This is the outcome of how I solved the problem. Now let's take a look at what that solution entailed. Our context for this story is secondary science methods. This course is delivered in a high flex format. And I'll mention it was already being delivered that way prior to COVID. This is kind of key. I have students who are in a master's program and students who are in the undergraduate pre-service teacher program. So if you are in the MAT, You're coming to me with a science degree, chemistry, biochemistry, physics, you name it. And we're just going to get you those teacher ed classes and get you through the program. You'll graduate with a master's degree and your initial teacher licensure. Undergraduate is a very traditional undergraduate pre-service teacher prep. But my master's students and my geology students tend to have time conflict issues. Master's students often work full-time. So a class in the morning at 9:30 on a Thursday doesn't always work well for them. And my geology students, sometimes physics, end up with their content classes conflicting with our methods class. Never fails. There's always a geology elective that a student needs, and it's at the same time. No big deal. I have this class designed as a high flex, so I'll just go into the system and grant you a time override so that you can register for both. And then I work with those students to help them understand how a high flex course works. Eventually, the students who are attending the class as they would think traditionally realize that this benefits them too. And when they have a family emergency or when they have some other appointment that comes up, they can pop in and out of class and they can still engage in the class. So what you're seeing on screen are the 15 weeks of topics that I've built for the class the semester that we were completely dealing with COVID. So we start off with science identity, work our way into standards. This is where I have the students actually compare the Idaho science standards to the next gen science standards. Arose by any other name. Other than calling them different things and stripping out a few things, they look pretty similar. But then they get introduced to Project WET, which is called Water Education Today, what WET stands for. We talk about technology integration. We have a second part to our workshop, and that workshop is where our Project WET partners come in and put on their typical teacher professional development workshop, which would then, air quotes, certify our teachers, our classroom teachers as Project WET teachers who can lead these activities in their classrooms. There's a week where we talk about the art of instructional planning, and I introduce my pre-service teachers to instructional design, basically just the ADDIE process as a high-level overview. And we go into what does informal and remote distance learning look like for science ed? Because oftentimes the remote activities are based on informal learning versus formal learning activities in the classroom. We talk about the nature of science. We go into inquiry-based learning and curiosity and that importance. We had a design workshop this semester because the students knew that they were going to redesign one of those Project WET activities for distance learning. So we wanted to give them an entire week to focus on what does that look like and ask questions. It also became one of the richest sources of data for my case study. There's a professional development carnival, which is one of my favorite activities. I have an assignment that I used to call BYOPD, Bring Your Own Professional Development. Now I just call it the Professional Development Carnival. Students have to go out and identify a STEM kit or tool or website, pick it apart and record a 15-minute demonstration of using it and explaining its pros and cons, how you might show others. So basically, if I wanted to show my classroom neighbor this particular tool, what would I show them in this 15-minute demo? And then the students all watch, they get a list and they pick 10 of the videos to watch for their carnival, and they submit a Google form that tells me which 10 they watched, which one changed your mind about the technology, which one was the most entertaining sort of thing. And then we share those results back out with the students. The class then moves into data literacy and assessment, classroom management and lab safety. And then we debrief from our practicum experience and work on facilitating our reflective practice. At that point, we start to look forward and I tell them what to expect in their internship experiences. So that was the 15-week structure, attending to distance learning since we knew we were going to redesign lessons for Project WET and deliver them online for authentic learners. On the right side, you see one of the typical agendas for a class, and these got posted every Monday of the week so that they knew on Thursday what our synchronous time together would be spent doing, what their asynchronous time that week would need to involve. Those headings that you see, Activate Learning, Project WET, Scientific Literacy, those headings match module topic headings in the learning management system so that students can compare the agenda to the module and stay on track with what they're working on. And then if there's other reminders that they need to help keep them on track, what they're working on, they would have those at the bottom of the agenda. So one of the things that I had to do for our solution, I added in that week 7 informal and remote distance learning because the students would need to take a look at what that looks like in the science world. And that's not something I had previously explored in science methods. I also had to restructure slightly and combine some topics together, like classroom management and lab safety, so that we could make space for that design workshop in week 10, knowing that sometime around Thanksgiving into December is when we wanted to be delivering those virtual science workshops to the public. So that was what we did through the semester, kind of a snapshot of what the setup looked like. The case study themes that came out of our experience is what I really want to spend some time exploring, though, because that's where we get into the meat and potatoes of you, if you will, of this entire project. One of the first codes that emerged as we were looking at the data, and you'll see in the table as we go through these, on the right-hand side where it says example, you'll see class discussion or practicum reflection comment or design workshop discussion. That's the data source that this particular example came from, because we did get permission to use all of the pieces of class to build out this case study from the students. But of course, the students' identities themselves are blinded, and that's why you see PST, pre-service teacher, F or A. We just gave them letter designations to indicate their identity. So our first theme that came out of this was, of course, technology. There's a surprise. But as we dug deeper, it was in terms of technology selections, technology motivation, and using low-tech solutions. So let's break these down kind of one by one and what they meant. So technology selection, behaviors of searching for and testing tools. This was actually really fun because the class itself modeled various tools. Jamboard was a common tool for us to use to put stickies and put thoughts on. We would co-construct in Google Docs. So there was an example where I would give the students a Google Doc that had a table and they could see their initials on the far left column. And then the second column would say, what is your personal definition of scientific literacy? So we started off class and they would each fill in their cell, or students who didn't come to class live may have filled in their cell earlier because they looked ahead at the materials, or they did it after we met as a class. We would then go do some activities. We would read some articles, we would watch a couple of videos, we would discuss as a class, and then they would jump back in and they would go to the third column and they would put some notes in about what we had just been looking through. They would reflect, and then in the final column of that table, they would redefine or refine their definition of scientific literacy. So we played with different tools throughout the semester. We were in Flipgrid, we were in Jamboard, pretty much any of the Google tools, because 86% of Idaho school districts use Google. But we were playing with different simulations even. Would I use PhET simulations for this, or would I use some other tool? And so we did have a number of which tool should I use for this? And it was great to hear the students talk those decisions through. If we move into motivation, I think that was probably one of my favorites because we would get examples like the one you see on the screen. It didn't work the first time, but the layout was wrong in the doc. Found a workaround. I know how to fix it for next time. There were a number of comments around that particular theme for motivation. When it came to using low tech, this actually ends up taking on some different dimensions that we'll see here in a little bit. But this is the first example. They were looking at using PhET simulations, which is a very common tool. It is an NSF funded platform, but they were looking for an offline version. So then the students started talking that through and they recommended using beans and rice in this particular example, which then in this specific example, oh, you can hit a math standard because now they're not automatically calculating it. It's not just giving them a number tally on the screen. They've actually got to go through and count and tally and do that. So some interesting cross-disciplinary pieces started to emerge. As we continue into the beans and rice concept, supplies and materials, that initial selection, and how do I replicate this activity at home where I don't have access to an entire science cabinet or closet full of things to just pull out for the students. So the conversation you see here, I love this particular example. The student was trying to figure out a rainy day hike and he knew he couldn't take them on a live hike during the activity. So TikTok came into the conversation of, oh, I just saw a TikTok recently and this person was just out pointing out things in their neighborhood. And that led to a conversation about, oh, well, I could record a POV video of a rainy day hike and pull that into my live activity with the students. here's where the beans and rice took on another dimension. Alternative materials. So in this case, this is probably my favorite, and I have to stop because it always catches me. This is the first time in my 15 years at this point in teacher ed, that my students self-engaged in an equity conversation without my prompting. We started talking about using beans and rice because it might be something they have access to in the kitchen. But what if that's dinner? Like that statement to this, here we are a year and a half later, but what if that's dinner? That's what echoes in my head now as a researcher, because my students got to that question on their own. What if that's dinner? But then it even went from there. We could use rocks. Okay, rocks might work, but what if they are in an urban environment? What if they're in an unsafe environment? What if they can't even go outside to get rocks? Conversations that for more than 15 years, I've tried to posit or plant seeds for students to think about, but it took them organically coming to it for it to be a truly meaningful experience. And then it led to the conversation about, well, could we make kits with marbles that you could send home or deliver? And that led us talking to, well, that might work if we were in a school district scenario, like what a number of schools did in response, creating packets that were available for pickup or teachers getting out there and dropping them off on porches. But then even thinking about some of the now remote activities, and now you have science kits that go home that you can subscribe to. Kiwi Crate is a fantastic one that my nephews absolutely love. But let's keep the theme conversation going so we can get into some Q&A around this. Classroom management emerged as a theme from all of our data, of course. And classroom management was easily something that we've always been worried about in teacher ed, because there's that concern of how do you get pre-service teachers that authentic classroom management engagement before they get into the classroom. It's a chicken and an egg conundrum. Which one comes first? And how do you jump into that cycle and start it? So in this case, it was interesting to see that anticipation and preparation were part of the early conversations. So the Flipgrid reflection comment that I pulled out for this example was talking through kind of the etiquette pieces. So I generally have a policy in class that cameras can be off without reason. Maybe it's busy in your background. Maybe you are just exhausted that day. And I would much rather see your still photo and hear your, or see, not hear, see your text in the chat box than watch you nodding off on video. Because at least I still know you're engaged in the chat. We have ways to still engage you. So this particular student was talking about appreciating that particular rule, but then also talking about bandwidth. The number one thing we do when your connection gets shaky is, here, let me turn off my video for a second and see if that fixes the connection. So they were starting to anticipate, what can I do now? How do I prepare for that? So this particular student was like, oh, I think I'll have them turn off cameras when we're sharing screen, but if you're comfortable, please turn it back on when we come out of share screen. And it was really interesting to see the students themselves coming around to, I need to be prepared for that. I need to think ahead. But then I absolutely loved watching them in the moment. So you'll see this one comes from the virtual science workshop interaction from one of the particular workshops. They were in the moment practicing dynamic classroom management in Zoom. They were taking advantage of using the video thumbnail to see that confusion and express, are you sure you understand? And then understanding when they were trying to load something in the activity, the asterisks in here designate different activities with the learners happening, but of course we didn't collect data on them, kept that private. So jumping ahead to, oh, the picture's not loading, let me send it to you. So then they took advantage of the file upload feature in the Zoom chat to directly send the file to the student. In a few cases, they would send the link if it was easily accessible through like a Google Drive link or something. But taking advantage of, I have extra ways to communicate with students and engage here. There you go. Yes, now you can answer the worksheet, recognizing and using these tools. Pedagogy came into play as an interesting example. So kind of back on that piece earlier with rice and beans, and now we can get it in math standards. It was really fun to watch them start to connect different science standards. So in this case, the students were discussing during the design workshop that it was a middle school activity. They were looking to do that differentiation up to high school, but that particular guide did not have the high school NGSS identified, and they knew that they needed to identify the correct standards. So the students themselves at this point became pros of using the NGSS website and the Idaho State website to search quickly and look, because they figured out the nomenclature, and ESS2 is going to likely be a deeper dive at the high school level than it is the middle school level. Then they knew they could jump to ESS2. And when they did that, they realized in this example that, oh, if I'm going to do it at the high school level, I need to make sure I'm using geoscience data, not just explaining geoscience data. And so they came up with using Google Earths and not just a static map, a picture of a map for the activity, and having them engage deeper with the activity. The last pedagogical sub-theme that came out was evaluation of instructional planning. And this was an intentional piece from a design perspective. Parallel to their class, the students were reflecting in their practicum course. There was a journal activity with prompts. And so they were forced into this reflective practice, if you will. And that bled over into the class because I did not use their practicum reflections as a data source, only our methods class. So in this case, I thought this was a great example. It was fantastic. The students themselves wanted to practice their instructional planning, and they were enlisting friends and family to help them with this, which is very common as a teacher. We often do that, but we don't see pre-service teachers talking about it. And so I dare say that semester we had more friends and family of pre-service teachers, at least in the U of I region, looking at how do we reflect and evaluate on our instructional planning. What were my 4 key findings from this case study? I'm so glad you asked. Modeling technology usage and dispositions was huge. It's one thing that we've talked about. It's in the literature over and over, but rarely do we have an authentic context to do that in. And that's what the students had here. Making equitable design decisions. I mean, maybe that should have been my first one because, like I said, it's the one that still echoes with me all this time later. Throughout the design activity, the students had to strip it back to the basic goal, rebuild the activity, and then think about what do they have access to. Dr. D, we're using video conferencing, but we've been talking about not having good broadband. Yes, so let's talk about that. What does that mean? Who are we going to have for our learners? Well, fun fact, my students actually had learners from Maryland, Florida, Texas, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. It's also what happens when I start tapping into my social network and my besties back in Texas saying, psst, sign your kid up for my students workshop. It worked. And the students did get to have some interesting equitable design decisions and discussions. They even then engaged with their learners about equity and access. Does this work for you? Could I do this in a different way? What would make this more accessible? Anticipating student behavior and practicing classroom management was an interesting finding that came out of this. The anticipation piece was key. And I think it had to do, this is clearly conjecture, but I think it had to do with Zoom being in the pop media headlines, Zoom bombing being a constant concern, and security and privacy popping up. I think that was one of the reasons why student behavior. Well, Dr. D, what do I do if? I did not include this particular quote, but there is a great one where the students were talking through what happens if I have a disruptive student. And we had talked about how to use the Zoom settings to turn off someone's camera, mute them, all of these little things you can do. And one of my students said, well, what if I just DM them, we're going to chat after class? So then we talked about when you hear that in the classroom and everybody's like, oh, you're in trouble. But in Zoom world, in Zoom land, if you get that DM, the rest of your class doesn't know. So that made for an interesting, well, that's a good idea. And would it stop the behavior? Since it was purely hypothetical and we didn't have that problem, we never got to see how it might play out, but that's one that I'm curious about now. And then the last key finding was that evaluating and testing learning design, when offered, every single student did a complete practice run of their workshop prior to the delivery. When I have done that for students who are in a traditional practicum, hey, I'm going to be in your classroom in 3 weeks to observe your lesson. Do you want to do a practice run with your classmates? Oh, no, I'm fine. And I have no doubts that it's because they were in a brand new context. They did not have the safety net of their teacher. They had not been working with these learners all semester long. And there was that technology layer. So they wanted to make sure that it all went well. So what was the solution to the problem? Well, it was that service learning collaboration so that we didn't have to worry about our schools and having non-essential personnel. It was addressing this from a non-formal education perspective because that's what we had access to. And if you look at what's happened since COVID, there are all kinds of non-formal science companies popping up to teach these activities and workshops. Our museums and our discovery centers are latching onto this, and they're creating different distance learning opportunities now. So I do think that that non-formal education piece was a huge part of our solution. Modeling distance learning tools and practices, of course, I really did need to attend to what were the tools I used for the activities in class, making sure these students saw the connection from their pre-service technology integration class to this class and saw the modeling in action. Number 4, building lessons from the ground up. This is probably what I found most fascinating. It's not uncommon, especially in science, to just grab an activity book, flip open a page. This one's got the standards I need. We're going to do this one. But then I don't have to think about it. I'm on autopilot. And sometimes in the middle of an activity, I might have to redesign it. But what happens when you build something from the ground up? In more than one occasion, the students had to go, well, wait, let me backtrack. Let me look at the side panel of this activity that tells me the standards and the audience and the outcomes so that I can rebuild what the activity in the middle looks like. So this was truly a good instructional design experience for these pre-service teachers. Number 5, intentional design space to plan and test. Building in that design workshop, our Project Wet mentors joined us for class that day, and they were available to give feedback and talk through questions. The students themselves leaned on one another. Sometimes we would put a group into a breakout room so that they could talk through something. But then even during the delivery, we had at least one Project Wet mentor in every workshop, and they also provided feedback to the pre-service teacher. And then that last piece, this was huge. And the students still talk about this actually. Virtual clinical experience with authentic learners. We can't make this stuff up. We can't be contrived. It's got to be authentic. And while it was a heavy lift for me as their instructor, I had to create all of these different Eventbrite events. I had to help market all of these workshops. I had to text friends that I hadn't seen in 2 years and say, can you please sign your child up for this if you're okay with it? But that authenticity was tremendous. One of my students in Coeur d'Alene was leading a workshop that had one of my best friend's sons in it, and they're in Florida. And they bonded because my student in Coeur d'Alene's grandmother lives like 30 minutes away from them in Florida. And it led to this, may as well have been a traditional classroom discussion. So that authentic piece was absolutely tremendous. But that's what takes us to my contact info. And when I want to open this up, I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time because I did a very quick gloss over of the class and the themes and what I got out of it. But I want us to talk about it. What does this mean? What does this mean for you? What does this mean for other teachers, society? What questions do you have? I see Royce chuckling. Hi, Royce.
So I have a question. In the article that we had read before, one of the something they expressed was they didn't see the relevance of doing this distance learning pre-service. So you've got this great model of how to do things. Any ideas on how to persuade the powers that be to see this as relevant besides COVID? I mean, even with COVID, it's kind of hard to change a generation of habit and
Mindsets.
mindsets.
Absolutely. This has actually been fun. And I probably, I'm going to have to make sure I mention this in other conversations. So one of the students who was in this particular class, she then went on in the spring after this for her internship. She was based in Portland, and we were still, of course, in COVID. She was student teaching here in Moscow, but online, because Moscow schools were online. Midway through her internship, the school district went back face to face. Like I mentioned, she lived in Portland. So she suddenly had her placement yanked out from underneath of. She could come to Moscow and like couch surf with some friends, but that's not the same. And she couldn't stay in the schools. So we actually wound up doing a supplemental placement for her with the Idaho Digital Learning Alliance, which is the online K-12 provider for the state. We do have other schools and charters that are online, but IDLA has 35,000 students enrolled. So they are the leading K-12 virtual education provider in the state. My student, is now our first intern to complete an internship clinical experience with them. Of course, Boise State's already been in this space, and so has Idaho State. And I think they even have had some Northwestern Nazarene students. But we now have that gateway. And our administration is now listening because our school districts are telling us that they don't have enough placement for us. And our students, our pre-service teachers are telling us that they're hearing from their mentor teachers in the field that they're teaching for this school district, but they also teach for IDLA online. And what does that look like? So we're having this like coalescence, this convergence of interest of outside forces that are now forcing the administration to take what we did seriously, because we have an entire avenue popping up. The other article that I like to point out here, Catherine Kennedy is one of my favorite researchers in the virtual K-12 space. And she had done a study with a team well before COVID, and it looked like about 2% of our K-12 prep included virtual clinicals. Just ahead of COVID, that had jumped to a whopping almost 5%. What we're starting to see now, though, there is no going back. There is no back. There is only forward. And the demand hasn't rescinded. There are so many other needs for distance learning, which means that the need for quality teacher prep and distance learning is only going up as well. So that has been a nice parallel push. Because we had a student come out of this that's successful, it's starting to get state attention that now we have this entire institution, IDLA, that needs teachers prepared for it. And the teachers that are there now are doing what they can, but IDLA is having to back channel all of this PD for the teachers that they hire. So IDLA is super thrilled to think about what does it mean if they get a pipeline of teachers who they don't have to do that PD with, they can do other PD with. It's a great question. Anything seems surprising in the case study? Any of the themes or findings that you're like, wouldn't have expected that? Crickets.
Tonia, we will take that as a sign that you did a wonderful job. Oh, Yvette's got a question,
Yes.
it looks like here. So let's turn it over to Yvette.
Well, I don't know how relevant it would be, but I think that Tonia could be the person to answer the question. For these preps, or I know this is for, prep for student teaching or teachers, etc. But for curriculum that some students are taking that's just online with Khan Academy, and I know this is just STEM education itself, what is your opinion about that kind of curriculum, which is video, based kind of thing, and what do you think about that? Because I have a daughter doing some of that.
I have a love-hate relationship with Khan Academy.
Okay, I know this. You didn't need to answer this question, but
No,
I mean, I
we're
thought you
good.
might be able to answer this question, and nobody was asking other questions. So.
This is a good one. This is actually a really good one to explore because this is a pain point in the field, especially for STEM education moving forward. Khan Academy was already huge in this space. It's actually one of my favorite places to send folks who are looking for computer science in particular, because there are some good videos and activities. When it comes to certain science content, it's a bit questionable. I actually have a doc student right now who has locked horns with Khan Academy over their chemistry content. She works with the University of Oregon on chemistry curriculum preparation, and she's identified several Khan Academy videos in particular that are not correct and need to be corrected. And the response she's basically gotten is, we'll hire you to correct it for us, which isn't what you necessarily want to hear. And that doesn't give me much faith as an educator when I have parents and others asking me, what resources do I give? To me, I treat Khan Academy like YouTube. It's another resource, and take it with a grain of salt. Okay. This is definitely one where we don't have a lot of great preset curriculum, nor do we necessarily want that, but we're still struggling with how do I execute a quality chemistry lesson at a distance? And that's where what IDLA is doing is much more on a project-based approach. And your teacher is very much a facilitator. You're given resources, be it written or video, to walk you through your own inquiry. But there's still the question of, I've still got to get content. I've still got to learn content. And how do I do that? So this is one where it really is on individual teachers to build a quality experience and a quality map of, I'd like you to watch this video, do this thing, and contribute in this way.
Okay, thank you.
I just had one kind of comment or question. I noticed that on your course that you were teaching, the schedule, a lot of time right now, it's a challenge that a lot of the teacher education programs don't have built in a whole lot of online training or how to facilitate, online or blended teaching and things like that. And you created a unit in your course. I just wonder if you have any comments or recommendations about how curriculum that already feels pretty loaded should include these facilitation elements, and whether that should happen and to what extent.
Yes, it needs to happen. I would like to see, this is actually where I can lean on Royce a bit, and one of his messages and mantras that he's tried to preach for years, and I'm behind him with the amen here. We don't just need that standalone course. We've got to integrate our tech across our teacher ed prep, and we've got to model it across our teacher ed prep. This is where I will also reference the TETCs, the teacher education technology competencies. Arguably, our teacher educators don't have these competencies either. So that's part of the problem we have to address. So we need to get better about that threaded of, you start off in teacher prep and you're seeing good modeling of technology integration and use all the way across. It shouldn't be that you suddenly land in my methods class and I'm the only faculty member that you've ever seen use Jamboard. That's a problem. But it comes back to our competencies as well. Now, I want to come to the comment that you mentioned. Yes, it's jam-packed. When I sat down and looked at how do I take my 15 weeks, how do I take my standard methods course and change it, I needed to free up a whole week. And how do I do that? And I literally had to truncate things. I might normally do inquiry and curiosity as two separate units, and I had to find a way to crunch those together. Same for classroom management and lab safety, because when it comes to lab safety, I'm dealing with 4 different disciplines. So I've got to talk about what lab safety looks like in chemistry versus biology, and geology, earth science is usually going to have more field safety than it is lab safety. So that can take a lot of time. And I basically had to say, folks, we're going to have to go into this together. We're going to crunch this together. And that's where I really did have to lean on my own background in distance ed and structure what is synchronous time, what is asynchronous time, and what does that 15 hours of, because it's a 3 credit hour class. So what does your 15 hours of support outside of the classroom look like? What do I need you to do to develop that? I don't think it's an easy answer, but I do think that it's a multidimensional answer. And that is, making sure that we're modeling across all of our teacher ed classes, making sure that we're making space for this across all of our teacher ed classes. And that's where we can talk about differentiation. So I can think about if I'm teaching a survey of distance ed class to graduate students, well, I know that we're likely going to have our common readings, but I'm going to have students who are interested in K-12 distance ed, who are interested in higher ed distance ed, who are interested in adult and continuing distance ed. So I need to build in ways for you to differentiate and explore your interest area. Well, I feel like we need to do that in teacher ed too. If you're interested in virtual teacher ed, then in your pre-service classes, you need to be given that affordability to differentiate, so that if you're in your diversity and context course, you're also thinking about it in terms of distance ed, not just regular teacher ed, traditional teacher ed. Not a perfect answer, but hopefully working us towards what we can do. And I see Christian gave us a comment in the chat. Strategies for modeling that have been most effective. So I did not intentionally say I'm showing you this tool because, but what I did do, and this is something that I have to do as a teacher educator all the time, I'm constantly scanning social media and talking to the mentor teachers in the classroom about the tools that they're using. And then I need to then rethink, okay, how am I having students do an activity in class? Can I incorporate this tool that I know their mentor teacher is likely to be using, so that they're going to see it in my class, then they're going to go out and work with this mentor teacher, and they're going to see it again, and they're going to get reinforced that this is what the tools are and how they're being used. So I try to be a little bit more subtle and not use direct instruction, but there are times where I'll throw in little things like, hey, did y'all know that 86% of Idaho schools are Google schools? Did you know that it's super easy to get your Google Level 1 certification, and it's only $5, and we happen to have some vouchers available in the Docheo Center if you would like for us to pay for that test? And kind of side loading the little hints that help them find value, so that it's a little bit of modeling and a little bit of motivation coaching without being, you must do it this way, because I don't want to be that person, because it is not this way. There's multiple ways. So thanks for that question.
Do you use other digital badges or micro credentials?
Oh, you're speaking to my heart. I love you. I wish no. And in fact, just last week, I had to talk about BYU's digital badges because my athletic training program. So the associate dean hat that I wear here at U of I don't get to be like the big full-fledged associate dean. I'm the associate dean of assessment and accreditation. So I'm all about streamlining assessment and evaluation and great tools. My athletic training colleagues have actually expressed interest to me about micro badging their graduate courses, their master's program. And so I literally just gave them some BYU resources on this recently, but I have thought about this. And I am, now that we're using Canvas, so I should mention that U of I just switched to Canvas this semester. Yay! I would love to start playing with that so that I can recognize my students who are putting the effort in to use and practice these tools, so that I can reward them at the end of methods with a digital badge on using Google tools for student engagement, and help them recognize that value.
Tonia, thank you so much for your insights and your preparation and sharing your time with us this afternoon. Students, if you'll join me in thanking Tonia for her time. So grateful for you and your contributions to the field. Students, will conclude our seminar now. We'll be back again next Wednesday at noon, and look forward to seeing you then. You're all excused.
Thanks for having me.